Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video we're going to read from Exodus 38 and talk about making true sacrifices for God. The context of chapter 38 is the Israelites are at Mount Sinai. They are building the tabernacle. In chapter 38 we're going to read about them building the altar. So let's get started at verse 1. Then he made the altar of burnt offering of acacia wood, 5 cubits long and 5 cubits wide, square and 3 cubits high. So we see here they made an altar. The altar was for burnt offerings. Now another word often used for the offerings is a sacrifice. Inherent within both the word sacrifice and offering is the concept of giving up something or doing without something. When you sacrifice, it means you sacrifice, you do without. When you present an offering, it means you are giving up something. And a very core and important and integral part of worship in the Old Testament for the Israelites was this idea of taking their animal sacrifices to the tabernacle and offering it as an offering, which meant that they were giving up something that had value and then they did without it. Now we're going to come back to that. Let's keep reading in verse 2. He made the altar's horns on its 4 corners, its horns being of one piece with it, and he overlaid it with bronze. He made all the utensils of the altar, the pails and the shovels and the basins, the flesh hooks and the fire pans. He made all its utensils of bronze. In verse 3, we see a reference to flesh hooks and also a reference to fire pans. That tells us also that the purpose of this altar was to burn their sacrifices or burn their animal sacrifices. Verse 4, he made for the altar a grating of bronze network beneath, under its ledge, reaching halfway up. The point of this bronze network was to allow the ashes to fall through. Verse 5, he cast 4 rings on the 4 ends of the bronze grating as holders for the poles. He made the poles of acacia wood and overlaid them with bronze. He inserted the poles into the rings on the sides of the altar with which to carry it. He made it hollow with planks. So again, we see here they made this altar. The purpose of the altar was for them to make their animal sacrifices. And inherent within this whole concept of making a sacrifice was that the Israelites would bring this offering to God and then they did without it. They gave up something that had value to them. Now this is a picture for us of a concept that we have lost, I think, in 21st century Christianity. In 21st century Christianity, we don't have a common mindset of thinking, what is it that I need to give up and do without and sacrifice for God? And yet that concept is taught in the New Testament. Now let's take a look at that. Let's start in Luke 9. This is starting at verse 23. And this is Jesus talking. And Jesus was saying to them all, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake, he is the one who will save it. So notice the word deny. Jesus said that anyone that wants to follow him has to deny himself. And when you deny yourself, part of that is giving up something, doing without something. We see a reference to take up your cross daily. In their culture, when you took up your cross, that meant that you had been condemned to be executed. And so Jesus said that anyone who wanted to follow him had to be willing to be executed every day. And then in the last verse, we see this concept that whoever wants to save his life would lose it, but it was the one who was willing to lose his life who would actually save his life. And so Jesus very clearly taught here that part of being a follower of Jesus is to deny ourselves, to do without, to give up something that is valuable to us. Now let's look also in Romans 12, starting at verse 1. Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that ye may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. So here, Paul urged us to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. Inherent within the word sacrifice is the idea of giving up something of value, of doing without. And we are told here by Paul that as we go through life as Christians, we need to do without. We need to give up something that is of value to us. So what does this look like in 21st century Christianity? Well, obviously there's a monetary component to this. We are encouraged as Christians to share our physical possessions with those who have need. And obviously any time that we're sharing, we're giving up something that has value to us. I think there's also a component having to do with the gifts and abilities that God has given us. As we go through life, we need to earn a living. And I believe all of us desire to be employed doing something that utilizes the gifts and abilities that we have. We want to be employed doing something that is fulfilling and brings pleasure to us. But there are a lot of people around who are not that fortunate. A lot of people are employed doing things that's not necessarily a good use of their gifts and abilities. And it's not necessarily their first choice of how they would earn a living. And it's very tempting to become bitter about that. It's very tempting to become frustrated. It's also tempting to blame God and accuse Him of not being fair and asking Him why He doesn't use our abilities. What we have to understand is perhaps these desires that we have are the things that we need to sacrifice for God. Maybe the desire to earn a living in a certain way is a thing that we have to give up and do without. And perhaps the way we present our bodies as a living sacrifice is to remain faithful and loyal to God, even though He has put us on a career path that is not necessarily fulfilling. Now, this also comes into play as we consider the role of women in church and society. The Bible has restrictions on the role of women, particularly in church. And one of the arguments that's used by people to ignore those restrictions and pretend that they don't apply anymore is that women have certain abilities. Women have leadership and teaching abilities, and they should be able to use that. And so we ignore some of these biblical restrictions in order to allow women to use all of their abilities. But perhaps these gifts and abilities that they have are the things that they need to sacrifice in order to serve God. Perhaps the way they present their bodies as a living sacrifice is to not use the gifts and abilities that God has given them, to not pursue the things that they desire to do when the Bible very clearly tells them not to do it. So again, in Exodus 38, we saw this reference to building the altar. The purpose of the altar was to present their animal sacrifices. Inherent within that was the idea that the Israelites were giving up something that had value. And that's a concept that we're also taught in the New Testament. As Christians, we need to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. And that means that as we go through life, we need to be willing to give up things that have value in order to serve God, in order to love God and obey God. If you haven't joined my email list yet, please do so. First of all, it is free. By signing up, you'll get immediate access to all my free content. This is the best way to make sure you don't miss out on any of my free content. In order to sign up, go to BibleMountain.com, click on follow. There will be a place there to enter your email address. Once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.